Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Focus Group podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of The Bulwark. And like the devil, we went down to Georgia this week and also to Alabama because the primaries are coming up. And we think those races are going to tell us at least a little something about where the Republican Party is headed. So Trump has endorsed David Perdue for governor, who looks like he is on track to lose. And his Senate candidate in Alabama, Mo Brooks, was polling so badly that Trump un-endorsed him. And some use cases like this to argue that Trump is losing his grip on the GOP. This is a sort of piece of conventional wisdom that I rail against, that I am totally skeptical of. I had a piece in the New York Times a couple weeks ago arguing there is no moving past Trump right now. And the reason that I think that is because of all of these focus groups, because I listen to these voters. And look, these voters, they want their party to be Trumpy. And our regularly scheduled guest had to cancel. It was somebody with whom I could really have this fight. But since he is not going to be here, the Bulwark family's stepping up. My buddy Tim Miller is joining me. Unfortunately, I think Tim and I are going to be a little bit more on the same page about where the GOP is headed. But that's okay. Tim, thanks for being here, bud.
I'm so happy to be with you. Should I do like my AEI voice where I pretend like the party's ready to move on from Trump? Or should I just be myself?
I think you should be yourself. But I mean, these focus groups, Georgia and Alabama, Trump voters, broadly speaking, these are not a group of voters that sound eager to move beyond Trump, even if they're not all for his preferred candidates. And I think this is just generally, this is a thing I think pundits are getting wrong. It's like a weird thing where they're like, okay, they got this magnifying glass out and they're looking at every single one of Trump's endorsements and they're saying, oh, well, if he endorses David Perdue and Brian Kemp wins, clearly Donald Trump is losing his grip on the Republican Party. And I just think that's the most asinine thing in the world. Like, well, first of all, that's one race out of, Trump's endorsed 200 people or something. So he's going to get a lot of wins on the board doing that. But these candidates, they're just Trumpy as far as the eye can see. Even when he doesn't endorse the candidates still endorse him, even somebody like Brian Kemp. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, the focus group voters, I think, are very revealing, but just the candidates' behavior should be enough to demonstrate where this party really is. So even if you are sitting cloistered in your K Street bubble, you should just be able to watch the ads that these candidates are running and know that there is no moving on from Trump. We're going to get into this Alabama Senate primary, where Trump unendorsed Mo Brooks, who, despite speaking at the insurrection, was, I guess, not quite fervent enough for Trump's taste and his insurrectionism. And even these supposedly normal, more mainstream candidates, Katie Britt, who worked for Richard Shelby, they are going on Steve Bannon's podcast and running ads talking about how the election was stolen and how we need a forensic audit of an election that Trump won in Alabama by a million points. The governor, sweet old Governor Kay Ivey in Alabama, was so worried about a primary from her right that she cut an ad talking about how the Democrats stole the election from Donald Trump. So overall, you just listen to the candidates themselves speak, and you can see how much of a hold Trump has on all these people, that they all have to kind of continue to live in this fantasy world where almost everyone to a person knows better, knows that the election was not fraudulent, but they are still going along with this sham because they know that Donald Trump controls the party. And then when you try to figure out, well, why are they doing that? Well, these focus groups are the answer to that question. It's because that's what the voters want them to do.
100%. One of the great things about having you on is you won't pull any punches about this, but what I can tell is happening, I get these calls from reporters all the time, and they always want to create this tension between the establishment wing and the Trump wing, right? As though the establishment wing is really pushing back. And that's why every story, it's unnamed Republicans secretly pushing back. Is this just a Josh Holmes, former chief of staff to Mitch McConnell? Does he just concoct this with the background of the media? No, we're going to win. And they're clearly hanging their hat on this opportunity for Kemp to win. But listening to these voters, it's just it's an embarrassing analysis as far as I'm concerned to suggest that Donald Trump hasn't dragged the entire party significantly in his direction.
It's a psychodrama inside the Republican beltway of all of the privately concerned Republicans who are Legion and have been Legion for 5 years now, who still want to be able to go to their country club and not feel like they are racist conspiracists. So they concoct this story in their head. I get into the psychology of these Republicans in my new book, Why We Did It, coming out in June. Go pre-order it on, Amazon or Politics and Prose if you don't like Jeff Bezos. But the short of it is this, right? in order to kind of justify their actions, none of these Republicans in Washington, none of these consultants, Jeff Rowe, who worked for Ted Cruz and Glenn Youngkin, or all of these big Republican ad consultants, Brad Todd, who wrote the book with Selena Zito, Josh Holmes, who you mentioned, who's Mitch McConnell's guy, all of these guys know all these reporters and talk to them. All of the reporters know that there wasn't an election fraud because they're election and campaign experts. So they need to have a story that they can tell reporters so they can go to happy hours and lunch with them in good conscience. And the story that they tell is that there are people like David McCormick in Pennsylvania and Britt in Alabama and like Brian Kemp who are talking about the drive-through ballots. This is election fraud light, right? That there were some rules that were broken, and they try to do this dance where they don't have to go along with the crazy Kraken QAnon stuff, and they have to demonstrate that there are candidates that are reasonable and that they can still do what they're doing in good conscience without going full election fraud mania. But it's all nonsense. And you can just look at it based on the evidence of how the even normal Republicans, with a few exceptions, but everyone else, if you look at these Senate races, is going along with the big lie to varying degrees. And this imaginary establishment MAGA fight only exists in the heads of these consultants and these reporters in DC who need to kind of create a narrative that makes themselves comfortable to sleep at night.
Well, speaking of strange bedfellows, one of the things that I'm going to play some sound here, so we're going deep with these voters and asking them how they feel about the Republican Party. And I got to say, it does give me some weird joy to hear them talk about how much they hate the establishment in the Republican Party, which is replete through all of these groups. But if there is one phrase that I had to say gets said over and over again in focus groups, it is lesser of two evils. So let's listen.
I don't feel like the Republican Party is much better than the Democrats, whereas the Democrats, to me, I feel like they're pure evil. I mean, just the stuff that they're pushing. But then on the other side, I don't know if there's any of them that have the you-know-what's enough to stand up to them. There's a couple of them. There's DeSantis. There's Cruz. There's a couple of them that I think can stand up to them and do what's right. But the rest of them, I think they're all so darn establishment and they've been around so darn long, that we're not much better off with them than we are with the Democrats.
She said it pretty well. She feels that the Democratic Party is pure evil, and there's so much special interest and agenda things that occur in the Democratic Party that I just absolutely cannot get on board with and never will.
I became a Democrat, and I just now, I don't know what happened. It's the complete opposite. They are the people that I can't stand now. They remind me of my family, and that they just want to run everybody over. And if you're not them, you can just move, just go away. You might as well not even exist.
Okay, so these are answers in response to us being like, is there something you like about Republicans, or is it just that you dislike Democrats? And it was like a strong negative partisanship answer, right? It was because Democrats are evil, but the Republicans also suck, but they just suck a little less.
It's negative partisanship all the way down.
Partisanship all the way
it's
down.
Like Democrats remind me of my niece with the blue hair and the nose ring. You know what I mean? It's like, what are you talking about? This is where sometimes listening to these focus groups can get you down, because it's like, what planet are these people living on? There's no difference between the two parties. There's never been a more ideologically sorted two parties in American history than the two parties right now. They don't think the Republicans are fighting enough. One of the candidates in the Senate race, Mo Brooks, literally tried to steal the election from Joe Biden and spurred on a mob to storm the Capitol. I mean, what more do you people want? And I think that using DeSantis as the example and using Cruz as the example really demonstrates what they want, which is just lib owning, right? That is what these people are looking for. There is not, with a specific exception of COVID, there is not actual policies that they want. They want particularly in these Senate races, they want somebody that is going to make them feel good by shit posting about the libs. And that is what they liked about Donald Trump. And it's a revealed preference when you listen to these focus groups. And, this imaginary establishment boogeyman on the Republican side like just doesn't exist. It's a complete figment of Steve Bannon's podcast and Tucker Carlson's show, that they have to like create this imaginary enemy in the establishment when the establishment is part and parcel with MAGA. I mean, Ron DeSantis consultant is Phil Cox, who's like the biggest establishment consultant in the world. And like, there's no difference between Donald Trump really and the so-called establishment anymore. But that fiction has to be maintained, in conservative media to keep these folks angry. And that's why they want more and more angry, more and more performative candidates. And that's why those are the ones that they're aligning with in these primaries.
Yeah, that's right. And also, Donald Trump has been telling them, like, Donald Trump runs against the Republican Party, right? He ran as the outsider. And like, that is still very much with them. And it's interesting, when you say the thing about the policies, Democrats in the focus groups talk about policies a lot. Republicans almost never talk about policies. They talk about values. And so when they talk about Democrats and they say evil, right, that's because they have bad values. And sometimes people will be like, well, I like Trump's policies. And I'll be like, what policies? And they'd be like, America first. And that's not really it's not a coherent set of policies. And you say something that I repeat now because I think it's a really good way of talking about people, which is it's all vibe. America first is a vibe. They're on board with it. The lib owning is a vibe. And it's because they think they're bad people who have bad values, who want to do weird stuff. And they hate them.
Yeah. They bring up DeSantis specifically because it's the vibes, right? I mean, like, there's nothing that DeSantis is doing that is actively different than what the median Republican in the House or the Senate would do, right? DeSantis is of that world, but he has just been able to, with an assist from the media and from the fact that Trump hasn't started attacking him yet, been able to project a more aggressive anti-democrat, anti-elite posture that resonates with these folks. There's a connection there with what they're looking for.
I mean, people bring up DeSantis all the time in the Trump focus groups. Words that come up all the time are like weak and strong, right? Like rhinos are weak. Trump was strong. DeSantis is strong. Somebody just said that, we want them to have the you-know-whats. They want the balls. They crave the combative style. And what he's doing is things like attacking Disney and things that are sort of performative that make the media hate him. And so he's got all the right enemies. And so it looks like he's fighting. And that's what they want. They want the strength. They want the fight. So let's go to this second, just because I brought up the word rhino. Word rhino comes up a lot in these groups when you push these Trump voters on what they think about the Republican Party. And let's listen to what they said.
My feeling is there's no real Republicans anymore. There's no Reagan Republicans like there used to be. They're all rhinos, None of them have the backbone to do what's right for this country. They talk one thing and then they'll vote the opposite way.
I think that, like I said, we have a uniparty in Washington. There are a few that are fighting for us, but it's not the majority. They're supporting a lot of the Democrat agenda and bills, and they're really not stepping up and fighting against it.
Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think, is a little over the top. I do think she has got our best interests at heart, just like Matt Gaetz from Florida. But I think they can be a little over the top. But, is that really a bad thing? There's so many representatives and senators now, I don't even know. You don't hear from them. I mean, I cannot name probably over 30 because I think they just show up and vote and that's it.
I know a lot of people want to criticize her for being outspoken and whatever, but I mean, she goes against the grain. She's not politically correct. She's not smooth with her delivery. I don't care. Again, I'm tired of being lied to.
Okay, so I just have to say this last two comments about Marjorie Taylor Greene was in response to a question that we were asking, which was, is there anybody in the Republican Party that you think is kind of extreme? And mostly the answers were Mitt Romney. Like that Mitch McConnell and Mitt Romney were too extreme for them. But this woman did start to be like, she was like, well, maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene, sometimes she says things that are a little crazy, but then she like completely talks herself out of it. Like, then she's like, but actually it's great. I love that line of what do they do? Just show up and vote. That's it. I don't know that is their job in Washington actually is to like vote on legislation. But the point, and this goes to the question of like, what do voters want? It's like, oh no, I want the people who are yelling and screaming. I want Matt Gaetz. I want Marjorie Taylor Greene. I want the people who are acting like crazy people.
Yeah, this was the most interesting thing for me. So in the last batch, I mentioned about how the two parties are not even close to each other, and how the voter and the first focus group, that was a voter in Alabama who said that, the parties are basically the same as far as I'm concerned. And then in this last batch, someone in Georgia says the same thing. We have a uniparty in Washington. So like this completely false notion that the parties are indistinguishable, that was like maybe a fair criticism in 1996 and isn't like true at all, is so pervasive that different voters volunteered it in different states and different focus groups. She goes on to say they're supporting a lot of the Democratic agenda and bills. What are you talking about? The Republicans have supported nothing. They supported the infrastructure bill. That's it. One thing, something that Donald Trump wanted. But they have to maintain this fiction in Trump world and in the MAGA media and in the conservative media to keep these folks riled up. And that's why they like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Ted Cruz and Ron DeSantis and Matt Gaetz, because all they see from those folks are the performative anti-democratic attacks. That's what they want. They don't want somebody who just goes there and votes party line with Republicans. That's not what they want. They specifically say, we don't want that. I guess they just show up and vote. That's it. So a person could represent them who all they do is go to work every day, do their job, vote conservative down the line. They're not interested in that. They want the performative stuff.
Yeah, and one of the things I keep trying to explain to reporters, it's like you listen to the voters and it is so clear how much they crave the performative side, how much they crave the combative side. And that is what people like Marjorie Taylor Greene honestly figured out. And it's what Trump figured out, that people want this. They want the performance. They're there for it. And I can see the lens through which Democrats and the media look at Marjorie Taylor Greene and think, well, clearly everyone thinks she's insane. Like, this is a crazy person. And I'm like, they do not think she's insane. Like, they might think she's a little bit outspoken or whatever, but she is familiar to them and she is speaking for them. She is representative of the voters in her district. Like, that is just a fact.
The media criticizing them is evidence that the person actually does represent their values, right? Because they've been so conditioned now to believe that the media is evil and that the media is the enemy, that the best thing that ever happened to Ron DeSantis was the media attacking him, right? And so when they say like, oh, this person just shows up and votes, what they're saying is, I don't actually believe that you're fighting for me if the media isn't attacking you and the media isn't calling you extreme or insane, because they're the enemy. We need to be fighting with that. And that's your job. There's like this perverse anti-incentive, right? Where, the New York Times does a big investigative piece. That's the best evidence that they're good in the minds of these voters.
Speaking of people who are outside the normal channels of politics, Herschel Walker, who you've written about in the Georgia Senate race. He's this beloved figure. He was the University of Georgia football star, which everybody knows. Walker got Trump's endorsement. One of my favorite comments, this wasn't in this group, but it was in a previous Georgia group, where I had sort of been like, okay, this aged football player, like, this is your best play. This seems ridiculous. And then I did a focus group with Georgia voters, and I was asking them about Herschel Walker. And not only did they love him, but when I brought up the fact that he had played Russian roulette with himself, that this is like a thing he'd said he'd done with loaded bullets, they were like, well, guess Herschel keeps winning. It just like, it was so illustrative to me, and there was a period of time where it looked like Mitch McConnell wasn't going to endorse him and that they were going to try to field somebody to beat him. That was when I realized that was wishful thinking. I mean, listen to how these voters talk about Herschel.
I think where I feel the problem lies is you have these rhinos who have been in office for so long, they've already been bought out. And that's why I'm for the candidate who has never run for office before, like Herschel Walker, because again, they have a desire to really want to help and make changes. And that's one reason why I voted for Trump, because I'm tired of the slick talking, I'm just going to tell you what you want to hear kind of rhetoric. Did Trump say stuff? Absolutely. Did I care? Not really. I mean, I'd rather have it straight and honest than sit there and somebody lied straight to my face.
Somebody different like Herschel, I saw his name the other day and I thought, oh yeah, my gosh, he's running. Am I going to vote for him? I need to really research him. If it were between Herschel Walker and Mitch McConnell, I'd probably vote for Herschel Walker.
So for me, Herschel Walker is actually a pretty decent pick because he's got the name. A name carries votes no matter what. It will always carry votes. But not to bring this into conversation, but he's also African-American. And I think if I think of Warnock, when he ran, I think a lot of the vote went to him. And I think with Herschel Walker, he can pull some of it. So I think that makes him a very interesting candidate for November, to be honest.
Before we even get into what we think, we brought up the Russian roulette, the spousal abuse, and listen to how they receive that.
That wouldn't sway me one way or another. I think there's always going to be a list of things I have to review. I trust my mom's research a lot. So from what I've heard, he would do some great things, and he's backed by Trump and so on and so on.
How do we know how many people in Washington, in Congress, in Senate, in, dare I say, the presidential seat, don't have some form of mental illness?
They dug really deep to try and find something to smear Herschel with, and that's the only thing they came up with. My understanding is that he has a very good character, that he is a patriot, he is for our Constitution, and heard good things about him.
So,
well, that's the only thing you came up with, Sarah. You know, he just menaced his wife with a gun and has multiple personality disorder and has advanced all kinds of conspiracy theories that are not true, and you know, little minor spousal abuse. That's all. That's it. That's all you came up with.
I don't think anybody had to dig. It's like he tells you in his book. I think he did most of the oppo for people, but this is actually, I gotta say, a place where I will kind of admit the low cunning sort of lizard brain genius of Trump. This thing with the celebrities, it befuddles normal political prognosticators like me who has a really good sense of politics, but doesn't know that much about why this Georgia football player would be qualified for sainthood in Georgia. Like, I would listen to him talk and say, well, this person's not qualified for the Senate. And then you listen to a bunch of Georgia voters and they tell you why he is just a miracle to them.
Yeah.
And so Trump's idea of sort of these celebrities that already have sort of a built-in reason for support, which was obviously something that Trump had, that, you know, this was one of the things that I just could not see in 2016. I'd never watched his dumb show, but everybody else had. And in the focus groups, when I started doing them, it was the first thing. Why'd you vote for Trump? Oh, he's a great businessman. I loved his show because he, like, you know, he fired Gilbert Gottfried in the boardroom, you know, and so he was a
decider.
Yeah, he's a very decisive businessman. And Herschel's the same way. They don't care about all this other stuff.
No, they don't. So when I wrote the Herschel Walker article that kind of ran through all of his conspiracies and how he had gone along with the voter election fraud and been a big supporter of the Stop the Steal stuff, and then all of his personal life issues with his wife, his first wife, that was March 2021. I wrote it very early because there's a lot of buzz about Walker running. And so at that time, they were still not quite sure about like where things were going to go on this whole Stop the Steal thing. And I think that's why it's just important to circle back to how complicit the so-called Republican establishment that all these people hate are with the MAGA establishment, because there was a moment where they were kind of acting like they were going to fight it and confront it. And I think that they were unsure and sort of waiting to see how things played out. And two things happened. One, the voters were completely with Trump and that they were going to be with people like Herschel Walker and that they did not care about his conspiracy mongering or that he was part of the insurrection. They kind of liked it. And obviously, because of his, celebrity, don't care about the issues in his personal life. And so, McConnell starts to think, okay, well, if that's where the voters are going to go, why fight it? And then you have all these other kind of candidates come up. You got Greitens and Mastriano and Barnett. And, you can just go all the way down the line of all these extreme, insane Republicans with skeletons in their closet. And if you're Mitch McConnell, you're going, it's like whack-a-mole. Like, I can't take on this fight. Like, Herschel Walker is like middle of the bell curve, right? When I wrote that in March, everybody's like, wow, the Republicans might have a crazy nominee in Georgia. That would be pretty out there. But Herschel Walker is just smack dab in the middle of all of the nominees that Republicans are going to have in these states. So they had no choice but to go along with it. So, I think that is all, emblematic of this bottom-up desire that the voters want this, and the cowards in Washington and the Republican so-called establishment aren't going to do anything to push back on it anymore.
Yeah, so the number one data point that people who find us annoying because we won't buy into there's this fight going on narrative, and we're like, no, the whole thing's Trumpy, everybody's Trump, and I don't know what you're talking about. The one thing they really hang their hat on is this governor's race in Georgia, right? So we've got Brian Kemp, who is the incumbent, and then we've got David Perdue, who you will remember lost in the runoff. Trump is mad at Brian Kemp because Brian Kemp, like the terrible person he is, he certified the election for Joe Biden. That was his big sin. And so Trump resurrects David Perdue and says, I assume, go run for governor, and I'll back you. And you run on a stop the steal platform. You just say the election was stolen and Kemp didn't do enough for me. And that's going to get you over the edge. And then that's just not happening. Like, all the polling shows Perdue is cratering. Kemp is doing just fine. And our focus groups kind of back this up. Let's listen to them talk about why they like Kemp.
I like what Brian Kemp has done. I liked how he handled COVID. The state seems to be running smoothly to me. Yeah, we've got issues big time, but we've got crime and different things like everybody else. I'm just not sure yet. I'm kind of tossed up. I like that Trump has endorsed Perdue, but then again, the fact that Kemp is way ahead in the polls, even though he doesn't have Donald Trump's endorsement, tells you something, I guess.
And just remember the last election, I'm David Perdue and I approve this message. Like, that's all I hear in my head. But for Kemp, I haven't been displeased. You know, he got my children back in school. He opened up the state, first state to open during the whole COVID stuff. So right now I'm leaning towards Kemp. But, you know, hearing that Trump is behind Perdue makes me want to do more research.
I don't know anything about Perdue. My mom is, again, she does a lot of research, and I don't know if it's just because of the Trump endorsement, because I personally agree with everyone with Kemp. I 100% am supportive of how he handled COVID. I traveled a lot during COVID, and it was insane to see how I felt like I was in other countries compared to Georgia. So just having that firsthand approach, I was very pleased with the way he handled COVID.
So there's a couple people in this group that are leaning Perdue that do care about Trump's endorsement. But for the most part, like, what is happening here is that Kemp is fine. They think he did a good job on COVID. I've had other groups where people talk about, yeah, Kemp certified the election, but he also passed that election integrity bill. And so they're just fine with Kemp. And I think what people miss when they talk about Trump's endorsement is, if you ask, does Trump's endorsement matter? The answer is, of course it matters. Then the question is, like, can Trump's endorsement overcome absolutely any political reality? And the answer is no. No, it can't overcome absolutely every political reality.
Trump isn't magic. Got it.
But that doesn't, like, change whether or not he overall holds sway on the Republican Party and whether he's pushing them in his direction.
So here's the thing. To your point about how he can't overcome any political reality, the Trump endorsement matters a lot in a vacuum. There is a difference, particularly in governor's races, specifically when it comes to people who are known quantities. Like, people do know their governor, and it is a little different than these Senate races, which are all about the vibes, as we were talking about earlier. And governors have actual responsibilities. And while Republican voters don't really care that much about policies, as we've discussed, you know, the one big one recently that was a policy/culture war issue was COVID. And so you heard these voters in the Georgia Focus Group repeatedly mention COVID. Kemp, like DeSantis, to less national fanfare, opened up early, got people back in schools, you know, wasn't a big masker, right? Like, that is what, you know, Republican voters wanted, because it was tied into this culture war. In addition to that, again, policies isn't the top of the thing, but look, I pulled up this from Eric Erickson, you know, who lives in Georgia and has a talk radio show there, so has a good feeling about what is happening in the state. He points out that during the last year, Kemp signed tax cuts into law, signed permitless gun carry for the Second Amendment crowd, transgender sports regulations, mask mandate bans in schools, right? Like, all of these culture war issues that combine with vaguely with policy, Kemp jumped on all of them, and people saw that. Where a Senate race is far away, and, you know, like, you hear from the focus group voters, what are they doing besides voting? What has the Senate done the past 2 years? Governors had an actual ability to tie into the culture war in a way that impacts people's lives. Kemp did that. And then finally, he passed the so-called election integrity bill and got this big boost, going back to my earlier point, when the media all attacked him and called him racist and said it was Jim Crow, right? So this Georgia race, you know, is not a repudiation of Trump. It is evidence that, you know, if you are a Republican governor and you tap into these culture war issues that Trump taps into, voters are going to respond to that. And so to me, that is what is happening. And David Perdue also is a total phony. Like, nobody believes that he's really MAGA, right? Like, you can imagine a different race, right? In a state where a Kathy Barnett type, like super authentic MAGA is running against a Republican governor who got a little squishy on COVID, and Trump endorses the authentic MAGA. You can imagine that playing out a lot differently than what happened here in Georgia. I think that this is really just more evidence of Kemp being an astute politician, who's able to ride these culture war waves than it says, anything about Trump.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like this guy's an anti-Trump candidate.
Right.
Like, this is where I can't understand the analysis. I think that what Brad Raffensperger did in Georgia in 2020 was extremely important. And the Secretary of State race, Trump did the same thing that he's doing to Kemp, where he sort of reached down and he grabbed a congressman, Jody Hice, and said, go run against him because he wouldn't find me my 11,000 votes, which Jody Hice dutifully did. But Jody Hice has also kind of struggled. And Raffensperger got big national profile for a Secretary of State. And, he released the tapes of Trump trying to shake him down for those votes. And so I sort of thought Raffensperger that there was just no way he could win. When you asked, what do you think of Jody Hice? Everyone was like, I don't know who she is. Like, everybody just assumed it was a woman. And there were a couple people who were still holding it against Brad and maybe would just vote for the other person who's not Brad. But there's been public polling that has shown that Raffensperger is a little bit ahead of Hice, and that then there's this big chunk of undecided. And I was just interested if you think, despite everything, I mean, I thought Raffensperger was toast, but because Trump has stayed out of the state, he hasn't been reminding people relentlessly about who Brad Raffensperger is and what he did. And so do you think that Raffensperger has a shot?
Yeah, I mean, Kemp has provided a lot of cover, I think, as well for Raffensperger, right?
Yeah.
Could have imagined a different situation, right, where Raffensperger gets totally demonized by, a governor of the state. So as much as I'm not a Brian Kemp fan, credit to him on that front. I still sort of suspect that it breaks late for Hice. I think this is a really important election, though. I hope not. Again, I think that Georgia is a special situation, both because of just the effective, in the minds of Republican voters, conservative governance that Kemp has overseen in the state. But then in addition to that, it's not like, some of these other states, as far as just the electorate makeup, like the Atlanta sprawl plays such a big role in the state that there still is a good percentage in Georgia of these sort of older, more traditional kind of business oriented upper middle class Republican types. And they have stuck with Kemp and Raffensperger. I think that would be a lot tougher to do if we move over when we get to the Alabama primary next, right? Like, Georgia isn't Alabama. So I think that he has a chance for those reasons, a kind of a unique set of circumstances in Georgia is working out in his favor. But boy, I don't know, a lot of undecideds. And you just think of that this focus group, the people who thought Jody Hice was a woman, presuming they're learning about it before they turn out, you would think that there would be a break for Hice among the undecideds in a close race. Hope not, but that's where my instinct is.
Yeah, I'm giving Raffensperger maybe a 1 in 4 shot.
That sounds right. Punch your chance.
Betting markets have him at 40%, though, which is very high for him. Way better than I thought he'd be doing. So one of our few pro-democracy candidates still out there running. All right, but let's talk about Alabama, because the Alabama Senate race is pretty interesting, too. As we were talking about, Mo Brooks started the race with Trump's endorsement and a pretty big lead. He'd spoken at the January 6th rally just before the attack on the Capitol. I quote it sometimes because he stood there and he said, "Today is the day American patriots start kicking ass." But he just tanked in the polls over the last year. And then Trump unendorsed him. But it wasn't because he got too woke about anything, although that was the claim. It was because he was running third behind the other two candidates, Katie Britt and Mike Durant. One of the sad things for old Mo was that the word was coming to him that Trump was gonna unendorse him, and he was trying to hang on. This is the ad that he put up on TV.
America does not need any more weakling, cowering, wimpy Republican congressmen and senators.
On January 6th, I proudly stood with President Trump in the fight against voter fraud. I'm running for the Senate because I'm tired of debt junkie, weak-kneed, open-border rhinos who sell out our conservative values.
That's why Mitch McConnell opposes me and supports Katie Britt.
I'm Mo Brooks, and you better believe I approve this message.
Well, that ad failed to save him, and Trump went ahead, unendorsed him. And actually, let's listen to what the group had to say about Brooks getting unendorsed.
That makes me think that might be personal and not political. I will definitely look into why.
I like when he endorses someone, but his endorsing and unendorsing does not have much weight with me because he has done that so much. It's part of his wishy-washy kind of personality. When you did something that really pissed me off, I'm going to take away my endorsement,
Yeah.
Mr. Trump endorses winners. He likes to endorse the person he feels like is going to win the race. When the polls came out that Mike Durant was in the lead, that's when he pulled his endorsement of Mo Brooks. There's going to be a runoff, I'm sure. But Mr. Trump pulled his endorsement because he was afraid that he was going to pick a loser.
And can I just say, in this group, it was the most people saying nice things about Mo Brooks than I've ever heard. They actually were kind of favorable to him. And I guess that was surprising because he's been tanking so badly. They all thought that Mo Brooks was a true conservative who'd done a good job as a congressman, and they liked him just fine.
Yeah, again, this is different from Kemp because it's not actual results in the governor's office, but Brooks has been doing what these people want, right? As far as attacking the left, doing the performative Fox stuff, going along with the Stop the Steal. So, he had some existing, well of credibility with certain people in the Alabama electorate. So that isn't that surprising to me that the groups weren't totally, going to flip on him just because Trump did.
Yeah, groups are funny. Just like this one where all the polls show that Brooks is falling behind, but the group still feels warmly toward him. That was similar in Ohio, where the person they were most warm about was Jane Timken. That was the person that they liked, and she came in dead last. So I think that might be happening here too, where he's got some goodwill, but for whatever reason, voters just aren't into it right now. And so as soon as Trump unendorsed Mo Brooks, there's this guy, Mike Durant, who was the one who was running in the front. And he's a former pilot whose experiences were the subject of the movie Black Hawk Down. And I had heard kind of behind the scenes, like he was kind of the establishment pick. People liked him. In his heart, he said that Biden had won or whatever. People believed he was going to be a good candidate. But of course, as soon as Trump unendorsed Brooks, Durant came out and said Biden didn't win the election legitimately. And, the election integrity is the number one issue for Alabamans. And these voters kind of like Durant up until there was a little bit of a turning point. So let's listen to them talk about Durant.
I feel like he's going to stand up for what's right. And I believe, he was POW for 11 days. I mean, he survived that. So, he can pretty much survive anything. And I just have a lot of respect for him and his position and things that he's accomplished and gotten through in his life.
Just echoing a lot of what the other folks said, he's a hostage, Black Hawk Down, that's your guy. And I guess the one thing that sort of strikes me is when I've seen him, public speaking, he's not much of an orator. I think he needs to work on his delivery just a little bit more, and I think he's there.
I started out liking him okay, but as times that has went on, I don't like him. Mm-hmm. I saw a video yesterday of a radio host that was trying to ask him a question, and it was about the Lincoln Project. Mike Durant will not condemn the Lincoln Project. Mr. Durant, are you against the Lincoln Project? Man never opens his mouth. And that says a lot to me. Who can't condemn the Lincoln Project?
So I actually had thought this was going to be a little bit of a mini scandal and not something that breaks through, but it is totally broken through. So Mike Durant went from number one, like he was leading the polls, and now it is Britt 37, Katie Britt, who we're going to get to in a minute, Durant 31, and Brooks 21. And that's from May 9th. And so the thing that has been killing Durant has been that somebody has come out and said that he is maybe like shares a donor with the Lincoln Project, but they have managed to attach the Lincoln Project to him, and it has totally cratered his numbers. Have you seen this?
I have seen it, and it's a little bit of like kind of weird Kremlinology, and there's some foul play here. Like he got a postcard from somebody who was pretending to be Rick Wilson. It's hard for me to kind of follow all the details, but the relevant part that started all this is that this is a big super PAC race. Club for Growth, all these big conservative super PACs are in. But there's a center-right super PAC called More Perfect Union, I think is the broader group, but they have a specific Alabama group that has been supporting Durant that is funded by mostly like Democrats and, never Trumpers. Some of them had funded the Lincoln Project, which I think is where this initial connection came in. They're coming in for Durant, and it's hurting them. All the evidence seems to be that these super PACs isn't actually helping. And this is why, the people here in the big center and donors and center-right never Trumpers need to listen to us and listen to the focus group. Everything that has happened to hurt Durant here with these voters is a result of people just not living in reality. They think that we can create this guy from whole cloth, who has this story as a pilot, and behind closed doors, the same groups supporting David McCormick, to, go to New York and raise money from the big donors and be like, well, just between us, like I wouldn't vote to overturn the election. You can count on me. But then publicly they go out and say all the same exact things that the crazy candidates say. And voters can sniff this out. The Republican voters are not looking for this. The whole farce of the Glenn Youngkin model is continuing to get exposed in these primaries. And the fact that it only worked because of a unique situation. We'll see. There ends up being a runoff here. Trump could save him. A Trump endorsement would overwhelm this sort of Lincoln Project smear. But then again, once again, it would prove that it only works to push someone through if they go whole hog with Trump.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I wonder if Trump will endorse. I think
we get a runoff here, probably, right?
So yeah, I think you're going to end up with a Durant-Britt runoff, which is when Trump could certainly make an endorsement. But I just want to say it's funny because of the establishment candidates, there's a true establishment candidate, even though she's running on like a build the wall platform, and that's Katie Britt. Katie Britt's been surging ever since this Lincoln Project Association came out for Durant. But man, this focus group did not like her. Let's listen to what they said about Katie Britt.
I try not to pay attention to because I think her personality, just the way she comes off and the way she speaks, I feel like she's more like a high school cheerleader, and it's very off-putting for me, and it's hard for me to look at her in a certain light.
She's too small, perky, and peppy. I think she's going to be a pushover.
I've known Katie since she was a teenager. She was a casual friend of my daughter's. Katie likes to win stuff. She liked to win stuff as a kid. She liked to win stuff as a teenager. She liked to win stuff as a young adult. So to me, I look at her like she's just trying to accomplish something personally. She's not going to be tough at all. She's a very sweet girl.
These voters could just sniff these people out, can't they?
This is like a small state, small world. And of course, somebody knows her personally. And the idea that she was this like ambitious girl who liked to win is somehow a knock on her. I did not care for that. Anybody who's ever listened to me talk knows that I'm not a cheerleader or the type that endorses cheerleading really as a concept. But I did sort of take umbrage. I don't know. I felt defensive on her behalf. I felt like they were going in a lot of different ways to say, like, she's a girl, and that's why I don't like her.
Yeah.
But what was interesting to me is that listening to them talk about Britt, didn't like her, but she's running first in the race. Kind of mixed reviews on Durant. He's running second. The person they like the most is Mo Brooks. And so if I was just listening to focus groups, I would say, I don't know. I think Brooks is going to do better than people think. But that's sure not what the polling's saying.
I think he could. These voters needed to learn about the other candidates, right? And they can sniff out what is real MAGA and what isn't. And Katie Britt, there is definitely some sexism in there. Okay, no doubt. All right, but compare her to Kay Ivey, the governor. Kind of gives us this like hard scrabble Alabama grandma kind of vibe, like tough Alabama grandma. She talks and it almost feels like it might be a fake accent. It's so Southern, right? And she has these 2 ads out recently to prove how tough she is about going after illegal immigrants and about how the election was stolen from Trump, because she's got this primary coming from the right. Contrast that with Britt, who really does kind of give off this striver vibe of a type of an Alabama college graduate, went to DC, went to work for Richard Shelby. And when you watch Katie Britt in her ads and debates and stuff, I know Katie Britt, right? There are a lot of these kind of Southern Republican striving women. who came to DC and sort of have that mien about them. And that is like this establishment mien that all these voters don't like, right? She reminds them of the other type of establishment Republican types that they feel like have been too weak or whatever. And I think that is the difference with Brooke. So who knows? Trump is said to, how Trump loves central casting. He loves people who look the part. Britt's husband is a Alabama football player grad, boo Alabama, and he gives off much more of kind of a tough guy vibe. They're running ads where he's like, she's the real tough one in the family, which says to me that they've seen these same kind of comments in the polls that she seems too bubbly or whatever. So they're hoping that he can use his manliness or whatever to pass that off on her. Maybe that works, but I don't know. Listening to these groups, looking at the polls, this looks to me like a race that if Trump put his thumb on the scale, that would have a JD Vance level result. And the first round here's coming up. That'll probably be a runoff if nobody gets to 50. So there's plenty of time for that.
Yeah, I mean, I could be totally off base here, but there's this part of me that wonders if he had just not unendorsed Mo Brooks and that Mo Brooks had just kept plugging away, if just he'd sat back and let Katie Britt and Mike Durant tear each other to shreds, I'm not sure he couldn't have kind of repopped as the person that everybody was like, yeah, he's fine. Better than these other two.
Yeah.
Well, it is so rare, almost never happens, that you hear in a very Trumpy group and a very Dem group where you hear people say the same thing and agree on something with the same type of emphasis. But in this group of Republicans, when we brought up Mitch McConnell, they could have been a group of Democrats. So let's end with your moment of zen. Listening to how some Alabama voters think about Mitch McConnell.
I don't like him at all. He's a weasel. He's low life. He won't stand up for the party. He will not do what he's supposed to do. He cannot keep his delegation together. He's weak. He needs to retire.
I think he's selfish and conceited. He's in it for Mitch, not the country. No party loyalty at all. I don't think very much about Mr. McConnell.
When I think about how much I loathe Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, I guess Mitch McConnell will do. But I mean, that doesn't speak much for Mitch McConnell. So, I think we can do a lot better.
I don't know. Is it one thing that all Americans can agree on?
Yeah, Mitch McConnell. If you look at polls of what is the least most popular person in all of politics, Mitch is the winner. So kudos. Great work.
Hey, Mitch, this is your prize. Every time I hear them just railing on Mitch McConnell, I think this is what you get for doing all that blocking and tackling for Trump, giving him those wins that he could have figured out himself during his administration. You get the loathing and scorn of the Republican electorate.
Well, I'm just gonna let those guys speak for themselves.
Yeah, Tim, thanks so much for jumping in at the last minute here. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for joining us for another episode of The Focus Group. As always, I would love it if you would go leave a rating on Apple or anywhere you listen to your podcast. Tell your friends about The Focus Group, and we will see you next week to do it all again. Bye.